Kלים Perik Chofei Mishnah Zayin. This Mishnah, I believe, is one of the hardest Mishnahs in Shas. But don't be worried. There are many different ways of learning this Mishnah. And the way we're going to do it, this Mishnah, is based, I believe, it's based on my understanding of the way the Chazon Ish learns this Mishnah, which is the basic mahalach of the Baal Tanura and the Rush, but it needs a little bit more explanation than you would actually get from the Baal Tanura itself. The Mishnah goes like this. Kol ha-kelim yesh len acharayim v'toich. We've discussed that before. That simply means the kelim have a different treatment, a split treatment between the acharayim and the toich. If the toich becomes tummy, the whole keli becomes tummy. If just the acharayim becomes tummy, if the acharayim becomes tummy, then it's only the acharayim that becomes tummy. The Mishnah carries on. V'yesh lahem, they also have base tziviyah. Different giruses, the Gemara says in the Chagiga, the Girus says the word base tzivito with a tes. First of all, let's translate this word. What is it? The acharayim is simply the outer surface of the kli. The base tziviyah is some sort of, not a handle, it's some sort of indentation, some sort of grip, where you actually, maybe it sounds like there's a machlokas the Gemara what it is, but it's something on the outside of the kli into which, it's an indentation into which you put your hands, using the keli, using this base sphere as a handle. When you want to actually move it across, stretch it across, the Gemara says from the word vayitzbot la koli, that's called the base sphere. So it's really part of the acharayim, but there is an indentation in the acharayim. It's like it continues with the wall of the acharayim of the outside, but it's a separate indentation used for gripping the kli. Says the Mishnah, v'yesh lehem base tziviyah. All kelim have a special din of base tziviyah. And then you can see in the Mishnah, there's a four-way machlokas. Rabbi Tarfon, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Meir, and Rabbi Yossi. Unfortunately, the way we've got to do this, the best way to do this Mishnah, I believe, is to do it backwards. We will deal with Rabbi Yossi first, and I'll explain. The basic rule of the base tziviyah is that the base tziviyah is exactly the same as the acharayim. There is no difference. It's part of the acharayim, it's a continuation of the acharayim, and therefore, if the acharayim become tamei, so does the area of the base tziviyah. And vice versa, if the base tziviyah becomes tamei, so does the area of the acharayim. However, we're going to introduce a specific kula called the kula of base tziviyah, which tells us that although it's true that generally the acharayim and base tziviyah share the same din, and when one becomes tamei, the other one becomes tamei. However, there is one set of circumstances where we actually split the acharayim and the base tziviyah. In other words, when the acharayim becomes tamei, the base tziviyah doesn't, and when the base tziviyah becomes tamei, the acharayim doesn't. Says Rabbi Yossi, this kula, that we have a split treatment between the acharayim and the base tziviyah, Omer Rabbi Yossi, le'omru elo liyodayim hatahiris bilvad, is said in one specific circumstance. In other words, if the acharayim becomes tamei, then so does the base tziviyah. But, says Rabbi Yossi, what does it mean for the acharayim and the base tziviyah to be tamei? It means that they can be metamei something else. What is it that they can be metamei? They have a din of a sheni. The acharayim has a din of a sheni. Right, so they can be metamei truma, make it into a shlishi, poshet. They can be metamei mashkin. Any mashkin that touches a sheni, remember the mashkin flip back and become a rishon. Again, no kula. However, they can also be metamei yodayim, hands, but not if the hands are dry. If the hands are dry, then they cannot pick up Tumah from a Sheni. However, if the hands are wet, then the Acharayim will be Matame the Mashkin, making them into Rishon, and those Mashkin will be Matame the hands. Says Rabbi Yossi, when we're dealing with the hands, with wet hands that are Tohor, touching the outside of the Kli, and therefore becoming Tomei from the outside of the Kli, then we make a difference between Acharayim and Beis HaTzviyah. Dahainu. If it's the Acharayim that became Tomei originally, then for wet hands, the wet hands have to touch the Acharayim to become Tomei. If the wet hands were to touch the Beis HaTzviyah, for this purpose only for the purpose of the wet hands becoming Tomei, if they touch the Beis HaTzviyah, it's touching something which is Tar. Truma touches the Beis HaTzviyah. Under the normal rule, it doesn't have a difference. But for wet hands only, we have a special kula that if it's the Acharayim that originally became Tomei, then the Beis HaTzviyah is Tar, and then vice versa. If it's the Beis HaTzviyah that became Tomei originally, and wet hands touch the Acharayim, then the wet hands remain Tar. The logic in this is as follows. Generally speaking, it is difficult to distinguish between the Acharayim and the Beis HaTzviyah. You have a surface, then it goes in an indentation. The Chachamim didn't want to make it too complicated by splitting the Kli into parts, which are actually quite difficult to tell apart. However, when we're dealing with hands, Tahar hands, people are very careful with their Tahar hands, and they're touching a Kli. Hands are something which you know, because hands are sensory. They know what they're feeling. They know what they're touching. It's not just a matter of visual, saying, I know that mashkin have fallen there or truma has touched there. When you're touching keli with your hands, you can feel where you're touching. And therefore, because the person is so aware of where he's touching, the Rabbanon were able to be a little bit more kolodik and say the hands know whether they're touching the Acharayim or whether they're touching the Beis HaTzviyah, and therefore we can actually, for hands only, we can split the treatment and say there's a difference between Acharayim and Beis HaTzviyah. But for all other things becoming Tomei, not wet hands, then the Acharayim and Beis HaTzviyah have the same rule, nit mozeh, nit mozeh. That's what Rabbi Yossi says. Now we're going to go to one line before we're going to do Reb Meir. It'll all make sense at the end of the Mishnah. Reb Meir extends this kula of Yodayim. And he says, I agree with you, Rabbi Yossi, that when dealing with wet hands, becoming Tomei, picking up Tumah from the outside of such a Kli, we can be mechalik between the Acharayim and the Beis HaTzviyah. But I'm going to extend this kula and say furthermore, when I'm dealing with a Kli in the first place, becoming Tomei, remember we said, if Mashkin Tmeim touch the outside of the Kli, it's only the outside of the Kli that becomes Tomei. Says Reb Meir, if we're dealing with Mashkin Tmeim that were actually on hands, in other words, you're dying Tmeos, and that's how the Kli is becoming Tomei through wet Tomei hands, then again, although we're dealing with Tomei hands, and maybe with Tomei hands one isn't so careful what one touches, says Reb Meir, but the person is still aware, he still knows what he's touching. So again there, I'm going to split. In other words, if wet hands touch the Acharayim, then only the Acharayim become Tomei and the Beis HaTzviyah remains completely Torah for all purposes. If the wet hands touch the Beis HaTzviyah, then only the Beis HaTzviyah becomes Tomei and the rest of the Acharayim stay Torah in Ganzen for all purposes. If the Mashkin Tmeim or anything Tomei is Matame the Acharayim and it's not coming through wet hands, then we don't make a split treatment and the whole keli becomes Tomei. That's kula number one. And then I have kula two, Rabbi Yossi's kula, which is even after the keli is Tomei, and now being done on what it can be Matame. Again, if what it is being Matame is wet tahor hands, then again everybody agrees, Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi, that we are machalik between Beis HaTzviyah and Acharayim, and we can say that if that bit became Tomei, the daim became stayed tahor, and vice versa. That's the end of the Mishnah, the chelik between Reb Meir and Rabbi Yossi. Difficult, I know. All Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva at the beginning of the Mishnah, they're saying that this special treatment, that for Yodayim purposes, in other words, wet Yodayim, either making the Kli Tomei in the first place, according to Rameya, or wet Yodayim which are becoming Tomei, Yodayim Tahoros, which are becoming Tomei through the outside of the Kli. There is a machlokas between Rabbi Tafel and Rabbi Kiva. What size kelim are we talking about? A big keli, it's much easier to distinguish between the Acharaim and the Toich and the Acharaim and the Beis HaTzviyah. And that's what Rabbi Tafel says. This idea that we assume that when you touch the Kli, you know, you are aware what part of the Kli you're touching, and therefore we can afford with wet hands to be mechalik between Acharaim and Beis HaTzviyah, only applies to big kelim. Because it's smaller kelim, the areas we're talking about, the Acharaim Beis HaTzviyah, are so small that maybe even though you're touching it with your hands, you're not fully aware what you're doing. So there, I'm not going to have any specific colour, and the normal rule applies, even dealing with wet hands, nitmol zeh and nitmol zeh. Rabbi Kiva says, no, lekoses. All size kelim, even small cups. When it comes to Tumas Yodayim, Rameya Kedeisa and Rabbi Yossi Kedeisa. When it comes to Tumas Yodayim, says Rabbi Kiva, in all size kelim, even the small ones, we're machalik between Acharaim and Beis HaTzviyah. Baruch Hashem for that Mishnah. And we carry on to Mishnah Ches, which continues, but now that we've done